You know that moment when you realize you've been the punchline all along? When the man whose chaos you've been quietly containing for 8 years calls you the best thing, like it's a joke, and everyone laughs. I stood outside his office with his coffee still warm in my hand, listening to him perform my devotion for an audience. 8 years of 3 a.m. crisis calls. 8 years of making him look like a king while I played the invisible hand. And what he called me, when he thought I couldn't hear, wasn't his right hand. It was his best little tool. The coffee didn't shake. My breath didn't hitch. Something just cracked.
Clean.
Final. If you've ever been so essential that you became invisible, stay. There are women who understand what it means to be essential and invisible at the same time. If you're one of them, this story knows you. And if you need to hear what happens when you finally choose yourself over being chosen, these stories exist. They're here. You just have to let yourself stay. My office was at the end of the hall. Corner view, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking Denver's glittering sprawl. Peter had given it to me 3 years ago after I'd restructured his entire North American holdings in a weekend. "You've earned a kingdom view," he'd said, that half-smile playing at his mouth. "The one that made you feel like you'd won something." I'd decorated it like I decorated everything in my life, tastefully, efficiently, with nothing personal enough to hurt when it was taken away. The coffee went into the trash without ceremony. Ceramic against metal. A soft thud. I sat at my desk and opened the encrypted portal I'd built for him. The one that routed through 17 proxy servers across 4 continents, because Peter Stalin didn't trust modern technology, but he trusted me to make it work. I typed 4 sentences. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position as personal assistant to Peter Stalin. All files have been encrypted and access protocols transferred to secondary systems. Transition documentation is available in the shared drive. Thank you for the opportunity. No explanation. No emotion. Nothing that could be argued with or dismissed as hysteria or female fragility or any of the 1,000 ways powerful men reframe a woman's clarity as a character flaw.
Send.
The screen blinked confirmation. 11:47 p.m. I had 13 minutes until midnight, until Peter's meeting would adjourn and he'd expect me in his office with updates, contingencies, the 3 things he needed to know before dawn. I opened the drawer. Inside was my personal phone, the one I kept separate from the company device he monitored.
My passport.
The envelope of cash I'd been quietly setting aside for 3 years, ever since the second divorce taught me that depending on anyone's permanence was a fantasy women couldn't afford. The desk was already clean. I didn't keep photos here. Didn't keep mementos. Over 8 years, I'd learned to exist in his world like water, essential, adaptive, leaving no trace when I evaporated. I stood, smoothed my skirt, walked to the door. The hallways of the slate tower, Peter's crown jewel, 60 floors of steel and glass and old money vampiric power, were silent at this hour. Security cameras watched from corners, but they'd been watching me for 8 years. Tonight, I was just doing what I always did. Staying late, handling details, being indispensable in ways that would only become visible through absence. I took the service elevator. The one the cleaning crews used, the one that didn't log biometric data because Peter had never bothered to modernize systems that didn't directly affect him. The doors opened to the parking garage. My car sat in its assigned spot. Reserved. My name on the placard. I walked past it. At the far end of the garage, near the loading dock, was the bike rack. Ridiculous, really, who cycled in a city like this, in a building like this? But I'd insisted on it during the sustainability initiative 4 years ago. Peter had laughed, signed off on it, forgotten about it. I unlocked my old Trek mountain bike. Tested the tires. They held air. I didn't look back at the building as I walked the bike to the exit ramp. Didn't pause at the security gate as it scanned my badge one last time and lifted to let me through. The November air hit like a slap. Colorado in winter doesn't ease you into cold. It just is. Brutal.
Clarifying.
The kind of temperature that makes everything sharp-edged and honest. I threw my leg over the bike and started pedaling. Downtown Denver at midnight on a Tuesday. Empty streets, scattered pools of streetlight, the mountains invisible in the darkness, but present like a promise. I could feel them there, ancient and indifferent, the way I'd felt Peter's presence for 8 years without ever really being seen by it. My breath misted in the air. My fingers went numb on the handlebars within 3 blocks. I didn't stop pedaling. Somewhere behind me, in a penthouse office with a view of a kingdom, Peter Stalin was wrapping up a council meeting. In 13 minutes, now 11, he would walk into his private office and expect me there. He would expect updates on the Vancouver negotiation. He would expect the revised contracts for the Chicago acquisition. He would expect me to have anticipated 3 problems he hadn't thought of yet and solved 2 of them already. He would find an empty chair. And for the first time in 200 years, Peter Stalin would have to face what happened when the person holding his entire world together simply stopped. The bike tires hummed against cold pavement. My chest burned with exertion and altitude, and something that felt like the beginning of being able to breathe. I pedaled toward the mountains I couldn't see, away from the light. Behind me, the slate tower glittered like a monument to everything I'd built for someone who called me a loyal dog. I didn't look back. Not even once. Peter found the resignation at 12:04 a.m. I know because the system logged it. The encrypted portal I'd built sent a read receipt to my personal email, a small vanity I'd coded in years ago, back when I still believed that being seen mattered. He opened it 17 seconds after midnight. I pictured him in his office, the one that smelled of old leather and the particular silence that comes with being the apex predator in a room. I pictured his eyes scanning the 4 sentences I'd left him. I wondered if he even finished reading before he closed the window. For 3 days, my phone didn't ring. The number he had, the company's cell I'd surrendered by leaving it in my desk drawer, went straight to voicemail. My personal phone, the one only 3 people in the world had, stayed silent in my pocket as I moved through my apartment like a ghost learning to haunt herself. I didn't pack, didn't make grand plans. I just existed in the strange, hollow space between who I'd been and whoever I was about to become. On the second day, I went to the grocery store at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, a time I'd never seen daylight in 8 years. The fluorescent lights felt obscene. The woman at the checkout asked how my day was going, and I realized I didn't know how to answer questions about myself anymore. On the 3rd day, I slept until noon. Woke up without the adrenaline spike of wondering what crisis I'd missed, what fire I'd failed to extinguish before it reached him. The silence in my chest was so profound I pressed my palm against my sternum to make sure my heart was still beating.
It was.
Slower than before. Steadier. I didn't know yet that Peter's world was ending. I found out later, much later, when Ingrid finally tracked me down, what those 3 days looked like from inside the slate tower. Day 1. He assumed I was sulking, punishing him with silence the way he'd seen human women do in movies, in the mortal lives he observed but never really understood. He didn't try to call, didn't send anyone to check on me. He had a presentation to the board at 9 a.m. about the Vancouver expansion, and he walked into that conference room expecting the 12-page brief I always left on the table, collated and highlighted, with sticky notes flagging the 3 points that would draw objections. The table was empty. He fumbled through it, used charm and 2 centuries of intimidation to cover for the fact that he didn't actually know the numbers, the projections, the careful architecture of language I'd built to make his vision sound like strategy instead of impulse. They noticed. The board noticed. Ruben noticed. And when Peter emerged from that meeting with his jaw tight and his eyes that particular shade of cold that meant someone was about to suffer, he found his inbox drowning in fires I would have already extinguished. Day 2. The Chicago acquisition fell through. Not because the deal was bad. I'd structured it perfectly, but because the signing was scheduled for 10 a.m. and Peter showed up at 11:30, having forgotten it entirely. The sellers interpreted it as a power play, a deliberate insult. They took their portfolio to his competitor in San Francisco, a young vampire with better manners and, apparently, better infrastructure. That's when he tried to call me. The company phone rang and rang in an empty desk drawer. He sent Ingrid to my apartment. She knocked for 15 minutes, called my name through the door like we were friends, like she hadn't sat in that council room, and laughed when he called me a dog. I wasn't there. I was sitting in a coffee shop 6 blocks away, watching steam rise from a cup of something I hadn't ordered for myself in years, trying to remember what I actually liked versus what I'd trained myself to tolerate. Day 3. The PR disaster. Someone leaked internal emails to a tech blog, emails about the shell corporations, the legal gray areas I'd navigated to keep his empire just this side of legitimate. Without me to monitor the servers, to track the digital footprints, to know which junior associate was nursing a grudge, and a thumb drive, the whole thing spiraled. His lawyer called him at 4 a.m., then his publicist, then Ruben, then the head of his security team, asking why the backup protocols weren't working, why the emergency contacts were all disconnected, why every contingency plan seemed to loop back to a single point of failure.
Me.
That's when Peter Stalin, vampire king of the American West, 200 years old and accustomed to bending reality through sheer force of will, finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him for 8 years without ever saying it out loud. I wasn't his assistant. I was his entire central nervous system. And I'd just flatlined. Ingrid told me he stood in the middle of his office at 6 a.m. on day 4, surrounded by ringing phones and unanswered emails and the smoking ruins of deals I would have saved, and said my name like a question. Like he was testing whether I was a person or a concept, whether I'd existed at all, or if I'd been some shared delusion the whole building had agreed to believe. He tried to call again. Got the disconnected number message. 3 hollow tones and a computerized voice informing him that the subscriber he was trying to reach was no longer in service. That's when he knew I wasn't coming back. That's when he realized silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything you didn't say while you still had the chance.
I didn't know any of this yet.
I was sitting in my apartment in the dark, watching the city lights blur through tears I hadn't earned the right to cry, mourning a man who'd never existed outside my own desperate architecture of hope. But I'd learn. Soon enough, he'd make sure I learned. Some men don't know how to love what they have. They only know how to hunt what they've lost. 2 weeks after I left, Peter's empire started showing cracks. Not the kind you see from the outside. The slate tower still gleamed, the quarterly reports still projected growth, the parties still glittered with the kind of people who didn't ask questions as long as the champagne stayed cold. But inside, in the places where actual power lives, things were coming apart like old thread. I heard about it from Ingrid. She found me on a Thursday afternoon at a small consulting firm in Lodo, one of those exposed brick spaces full of startups and people young enough to still believe disruption was virtuous. I'd taken a contract position. Temporary. Anonymous. The kind of work where nobody asks about your past because they're too busy trying to invent their future. I was reviewing financial projections when she walked in wearing a coat that cost more than the entire office's monthly revenue. She looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired in a way that immortality shouldn't allow. He's losing his mind, she said, not bothering with hello. The Toronto clan pulled their alliance. The Seattle syndicate is questioning whether he can be trusted to hold territory. Yesterday, he missed a call with the European Council because he forgot they exist in a different time zone. I didn't look up from my spreadsheet. He has a calendar. He has 17 calendars. You were the one who synchronized them. Then I guess he should learn to read. Ingrid sat down across from me without being invited.
Gwen.
There are alliances fracturing that took him decades to build. There are contracts dissolving because he can't remember which lies he told to which people. He fired 3 assistants in 4 days because none of them could anticipate his needs the way you. The way I what? I finally met her eyes. The way I destroyed myself trying to read his mind? The way I gave up sleeping and eating regular meals and having a life that existed outside his radius? Is that the skill set you're looking for? She flinched. Good. He didn't know, she said quietly. None of us knew how much you were actually doing. You knew enough to laugh. The silence that followed was the kind that leaves scars. She looked away first. I'm not here to apologize, Ingrid finally said. I'm here because he's breaking, Gwen. Actually breaking. 2 nights ago, he stood in the middle of the council chamber and couldn't remember what year it was. He's losing time. Losing coherence. The weight of... She stopped, choosing her words carefully. The weight of what he is, what he carries, it's crushing him. You were the ballast. We didn't understand it, but you were keeping him anchored to something human, something manageable. Without you, without me, he has to carry his own darkness. I closed my laptop, looked at her directly. That's not my problem anymore. He's hired someone to find you. That made my heart skip. Just one beat, but she caught it. Saw the fear flicker across my face before I could lock it down. An investigator, Ingrid continued. One of those mortal specialists who finds people who don't want to be found. He's obsessed, Gwen. He talks about you like, she stopped again. Searching for the right framework. Like you were the only real thing in 200 years of existence, and he just figured it out too late. I wanted to feel vindicated. Wanted that information to land like victory, like proof that I'd mattered after all. Instead, it just felt heavy.
Sad.
Like watching someone mourn a version of you that never actually existed. He called me his loyal dog, I said softly. In front of everyone who's supposed to respect me. He said I was desperate. Replaceable. He performed my devotion like it was a joke. Ingrid, you don't get to come here now and tell me he's suffering like that gives him a claim on my mercy. I'm not asking you to go back. Then what are you asking? She stood up, buttoned her coat with precise, careful movements. I'm asking you to disappear better. Because when he finds you, and he will find you, he's not going to accept no as an answer. And I don't know who he is anymore without you there to make him human. She left. The door chimed softly behind her. I sat there in that bright, optimistic office surrounded by people who believed in quarterly growth and vision boards and the kind of future you could build with enough coffee and correct branding. I thought about Peter standing in a council chamber, losing time, losing coherence, finally feeling the full weight of eternity without anyone to filter it through. I thought about how I'd spent 8 years absorbing his rage, his exhaustion, his casual cruelty, letting it poison me slowly because I'd confused sacrifice with love. I thought about how some women spend their whole lives learning that you can't save a man from himself. You can only drown alongside him or learn to swim away. That night, I started packing. Not because I was afraid of him finding me, though I was, but because I realized I'd been hiding in the shallow end. Taking small contracts, temporary positions, half living in the margins of someone else's city, someone else's territory, waiting for permission to take up space. I called a number I'd kept folded in my wallet for 3 years. A headhunter in California who'd been trying to recruit me since before I'd become Peter's shadow. She answered on the second ring. I'm ready, I said. Ready for what? To be expensive. Irreplaceable. Everything I was for someone who couldn't see it. I took a breath. I want you to find me the kind of position where my absence would be catastrophic. And I want them to pay me like they know it. She laughed. Low and knowing. Gwen Stacy. I was wondering when you'd remember you were worth something. 2 days later, I had 3 offers. All of them in cities Peter Stalin didn't control. All of them paying double of what he'd ever given me. I chose Denver. His city. His territory. Because running felt like admitting he'd won. And I was done letting powerful men rewrite my story. 6 weeks after I walked away from Peter Stalin, I stopped recognizing myself in mirrors. Not in a bad way. In the way you stop recognizing a house after you've finally cleared out the rooms you'd been using for storage. Suddenly there's space.
Light.
The realization that you'd been living in a fraction of the square footage you'd paid for. I'd taken the position with Castellane Industries, a supernatural holdings company run by a vampire named Josephine, who'd been turned in the 1920s and still carried herself like someone who'd survived prohibition by being smarter than the men trying to control her. She didn't want an assistant. She wanted a strategist. Someone who understood how power actually moved in the places where humans and immortals negotiated reality. She wanted someone who'd been inside Peter Stalin's operation and lived to talk about it. I don't need you to be loyal, she'd said during my interview, her red nails tapping against a crystal tumbler of something that definitely wasn't wine. I need you to be expensive.
Competent.
And absolutely certain that your value isn't negotiable. I'd looked her in the eye and named a salary that made her laugh. She'd doubled it. That was 6 weeks ago. Now I had an office with my name on the door, my actual name, not just a title someone had granted me. I had a team. I had clients across 3 states who paid consultation fees that made my years with Peter look like charity work. I had a calendar I controlled, meetings I scheduled, decisions that were mine to make without checking whether they'd inconvenience someone else's empire. I'd gained 12 pounds. The good kind, the kind that comes from eating lunch instead of surviving on coffee and adrenaline. My hair had grown past my shoulders. I'd stopped dyeing away the gray that was starting to thread through the blonde because Josephine had looked at it during a board meeting and said, "Women who've survived something shouldn't hide the evidence." I looked alive. That's what shocked me most. I looked like someone who existed in her own body instead of haunting it. The morning the investigator found me, I was having lunch at Mercantile with 2 executives from a tech conglomerate that was trying to navigate a partnership with a werewolf pack in Montana. Delicate work. The kind that required understanding that some negotiations weren't about contracts. They were about trust, history, the generational weight of who'd wronged whom and when. I was good at it. Better than good. Turned out that 8 years of translating Peter's impulses into coherent strategy had taught me how to speak the language of power in all its dialects. I was explaining territorial protocols when I felt it. That particular awareness that comes from being watched by someone who knows how to watch. Not the casual glance of other diners. Something focused.
Predatory.
I looked up. He was sitting 3 tables away. Older guy, maybe 60, wearing a jacket that said he worked for a living but made decent money doing it. He had a phone angled like he was reading something, but his eyes were on me. When our gazes met, he didn't look away. Just nodded.
Once.
A small acknowledgement that said, "I found you." My chest went tight. I excused myself from the table. Walked to the bathroom with measured steps, not running, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing fear. Locked myself in a stall and pulled out my phone with shaking hands. Ingrid answered on the first ring. "He knows where you are." I just saw him. The investigator. His name is Howard Finch.
Former FBI.
Peter's paying him enough that he won't stop just because you ask nicely.
She paused.
You need to decide what you're going to do, Gwen. Because Peter's coming. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but he's coming. And when he does, what? I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. What exactly do you think is going to happen, Ingrid? He's going to show up and demand I come back? Threaten me? Beg? I think he's going to make you remember why you stayed as long as you did. The line went dead. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. This woman staring back, clear-eyed, healthy, wearing a dress she'd chosen because she liked it, not because it projected competence or palatability. She didn't look like someone who could be convinced to return to a man who'd called her a dog. But God, there was still a part of me, small and pathetic and stubbornly alive, that wondered what he'd say, what apology he'd crafted, whether 200 years of existence had finally taught him the difference between owning someone and valuing them. I went back to the table, finished the lunch, closed the deal, shook hands with 2 executives who had no idea they'd just watched someone choose not to run. Howard Finch was gone when I looked for him, but his coffee cup was still on the table, steam rising from it. Still warm. A message. A promise. I'd been found. That night, I sat in my apartment, a real apartment now, not the sterile corporate housing Peter had provided, but a place with bookshelves I'd filled, and art I'd chosen, and furniture that didn't match because I'd never had to make aesthetic decisions before, and I was learning, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 years. Not fear. Not exactly. Anticipation. Because I'd changed. The woman Peter had dismissed was gone. What he'd find when he came for me wasn't the shadow who'd absorbed his darkness until she nearly disappeared. He was going to find someone who'd learned to reflect it back. And I wasn't sure either of us would survive what came next. He came on a Tuesday night at 11:47 p.m. I knew it was him before the knock. The air in my apartment changed, thickened, cooled, like the atmosphere before a storm. That's what proximity to old power feels like. It announces itself in the primitive part of your brain that still remembers when humans were prey. 3 measured knocks. Not aggressive. Almost polite. I stood in my kitchen with a glass of wine I'd poured an hour ago and hadn't touched, staring at the door like it might reveal something if I waited long enough. "I know you're there, Gwen." His voice came through the wood, low and familiar, and wrong because I'd spent 6 weeks learning to exist without it. "I can hear your heartbeat." Of course he could. I set down the wine, walked to the door. Didn't open it. "Go away, Peter. We need to talk." "No, you need to talk. I need you to respect the fact that I left." Silence. Long enough that I thought maybe he'd actually listened. Then, "I'm not leaving until you explain." I submitted my resignation. 4 sentences. Effective immediately. "What part requires explanation?" "The part where you vanished like I meant nothing." His voice cracked on the last word. Actual emotion bleeding through that carefully constructed control. 8 years, Gwen. You don't just walk away from 8 years without a conversation. I almost laughed. Almost opened the door just to let him see my face when I said it. You walked away from 8 years every single day. You just did it while I was still in the room. The lock clicked. Not because I'd touched it. Because he'd overridden it. 200 years old. And he still thought locks were suggestions. The door swung open. He stood in my hallway looking like everything I'd been trying to forget. Expensive suit, dark hair pushed back like he'd been running his hands through it, eyes that particular shade of hazel that shifted toward gold when he was emotional. He looked thinner, tired in a way that supernatural healing shouldn't allow. He looked like he'd been looking for me in every empty room of that tower for 6 weeks. You changed your hair, he said, which was such a devastatingly Peter thing to say that I felt something crack in my chest. You broke into my apartment. You disconnected your number. Erased yourself from every database I have access to. What was I supposed to do? Respect my choice. I didn't move from where I stood. Didn't invite him in further. I left, Peter. That's the explanation. I don't owe you more than that. He stepped inside anyway. Closed the door behind him with a gentleness that felt worse than violence. You owe me 8 years of context. You owe me the reason why the woman who scheduled my entire existence suddenly decided I wasn't worth a conversation. You want context? Something in me snapped. All the careful distance I'd built, the professional composure, the decision to be gracious in my exit, it shattered.
Fine.
You called me your loyal dog, Peter. In front of your entire council. You said I was desperate. Replaceable. You laughed about how I looked at you like you were a project I could fix. You performed my devotion like it was dinner theater for vampires who've forgotten what sincerity looks like. He went still. Completely, supernaturally still. You heard that. I heard all of it. Every word. Every laugh. I felt tears building and hated myself for them. I stood outside that room with your coffee in my hand, 98.6 degrees, exactly how you like it because I'd memorized every single one of your preferences, and I listened to you reduce 8 years of my life to a punchline. Gwen. Do you know what I did after? I cut him off. I didn't cry. Didn't scream. I walked back to my office, threw away your coffee, and submitted my resignation in 12 minutes. Because that's how long it took me to realize that you were right. I was desperate. I had built my entire identity around being indispensable to someone who'd never once asked what I needed. He moved toward me, and I stepped back. Held up a hand.
Don't.
Don't come closer. Don't touch me. Don't use 2 centuries of supernatural charisma to make me forget why I left. I didn't mean it.
His voice was raw now.
Broken. Everything I said, I didn't. I was performing for them, Gwen. Playing the part they expect. The untouchable king who doesn't need anyone. It wasn't true. That makes it worse. The words tore out of me. You threw me away for an audience. You sacrificed me to maintain an image. At least if you'd meant it, it would have been honest. Then let me be honest now. He closed the distance between us in that preternatural way he had, suddenly just there, close enough that I could smell cedar and smoke and the particular scent of his cologne that I'd been trying to wash out of my memory. I can't function without you. The empire is collapsing. I'm losing time, losing coherence. I stood in a council meeting last week and couldn't remember what century I was in because you weren't there to anchor me to the present. That's not love, Peter. That's dependency. It's both. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, hating myself for the relief that flooded through me at his touch. I was a fool. A arrogant, immortal fool who didn't understand what he had until it was gone. Come back.
Please.
Whatever you want, salary, title, equity, I'll give you half the empire if that's what it takes. I pulled my hand away. You still don't understand. Then help me understand. I walked to the window, looked out at the Denver skyline, at the city I'd claimed as my own instead of his. For 8 years, I absorbed everything you didn't want to feel. Every rage, every exhaustion, every ancient darkness that comes with being what you are. I didn't know I was doing it at first. I just knew that when I was near you, you seemed more human, more present, more capable of existing in the world without destroying it. I turned to face him. It was killing me, Peter. Literally poisoning me. The headaches I told you were migraines? That was your darkness pooling in my skull. The exhaustion I blamed on long hours? That was my body trying to process 200 years of trauma that wasn't mine. I didn't leave because you hurt my feelings. I left because staying another month would have stopped my heart. The color drained from his face. Actually drained, leaving him looking corpse pale in my apartment light. You never said. I didn't know. I thought I was just tired, stressed, failing at basic self-care. It wasn't until I left that my body started recovering, that I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning in someone else's grief. He sat down heavily on my couch, that preternatural grace failing him entirely. I was killing you, yes. And you still stayed. For 8 years. Because I loved you. The words came out quiet, simple, devastating in their past tense. Because I thought if I just tried hard enough, sacrificed deep enough, you'd eventually see me as something more than useful. Silence filled my apartment like a third presence. When Peter finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. What do I do? How do I fix this? I looked at this man, this creature, this king, this thing I'd loved enough to die for, and felt nothing but a tired, aching compassion. You let me go, I said. You go back to your tower. You find someone else to filter your darkness, or you learn to carry it yourself. And you let me build a life that doesn't require me to disappear. I can't do that. Then we have nothing else to say to each other. I walked to the door, opened it, stood there waiting. Peter looked at me like I was something precious he'd broken and only just realized was irreplaceable. Then he stood, straightened his suit, walked toward the door with the careful dignity of someone trying not to shatter. He paused in the threshold. If I had known, if I had understood what you were carrying, you would have what? Loved me? Valued me? Seen me as human? I met his eyes. You had 8 years to figure it out, Peter. The information was right there. You just decided my pain wasn't worth noticing. He left without another word. I closed the door, locked it, slid down to the floor, and finally, let myself break. Not because I wanted him back, but because even now, even knowing everything, part of me still hoped he'd fight harder to stay. He came back 3 hours later. I was still on the floor when I heard the knock. Softer this time. Almost apologetic. Gwen. His voice through the door sounded like something breaking in slow motion. Please. I need to say something. Then I'll leave. I promise. I should have told him no. Should have stayed on that floor and let him stand in the hallway until he understood that some doors close permanently. But there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Fear. I opened the door. He looked worse than he had 3 hours ago. Skin gray, eyes sunken, standing like gravity, had suddenly remembered he was subject to its laws. He looked mortal. Dying. I can't carry it, he said without preamble. The weight you were filtering. I've been trying since you left. Trying to manage it, to contain it the way you did. I can't. He laughed, brittle and sharp. 200 years old, and I'm being destroyed by my own existence because the woman who made me bearable is gone. That's not my responsibility anymore. I know. He swayed slightly, caught himself on the doorframe. I know. I'm not here to ask you to come back. I'm here to tell you I understand now. Why you left. What it cost you. What I was too blind and arrogant and terrified to see. Terrified. The word caught me off guard. Of needing you. He looked at me with something raw and honest breaking across his face. I've been alone for 2 centuries, Gwen. Surrounded by people but fundamentally, catastrophically alone. Because I convinced myself that needing someone was weakness. That letting myself depend on another person's presence would give them power over me. So when you became essential, when I started noticing that I breathed easier when you were near, that the noise in my head quieted when you touched my arm. He stopped. Swallowed hard. I panicked. I performed distance.
Cruelty.
I made you small in front of others because you'd become too important in private. I felt tears building again. You should have just told me. I should have done 1,000 things differently. He took a shaky breath. Can I come in? Not to argue. Not to convince you. Just to talk. The way we never did. The conversation we should have had 8 years ago before I let you become my lifeline without acknowledging what that meant. I stepped aside. We sat on my couch like strangers learning each other's language. He told me about the weight of immortality, how every year added another layer of exhaustion, another memory of violence, another reason to stop caring about the present. He told me about the first time he noticed I made it bearable, how terrifying that had been. How he tried to prove he didn't need it by taking me for granted. I told him about my marriages. How I'd learned to make myself indispensable because being needed felt safer than being wanted. How I'd brought that pattern into his life and let it consume me because at least it was familiar. We talked until the sky started bleeding pink at the edges. About power and loneliness and the particular violence of not knowing how to love someone without destroying them. About how some people spend centuries avoiding intimacy because they're afraid of what they'll lose, and some people spend decades pursuing it because they're afraid of who they'll be without it. I need to tell you something, Peter said as dawn broke fully over the mountains. And I need you to hear it not as manipulation, but as honesty. I nodded. I'm dying. He said it simply, factually. Without you filtering the darkness, it's eating me from the inside. The ancient exhaustion, the accumulated trauma of 200 years, it's crushing me. I have maybe 3 weeks, a month if I'm lucky. My breath caught. Peter, I'm not telling you to guilt you into coming back. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that you mattered. That your presence wasn't just useful, it was the only thing keeping me tethered to something resembling humanity. And I'm sorry I made you pay for that with your health. Your peace. Your sense of self. He stood, straightened his jacket with trembling hands. Thank you for tonight. For letting me say the things I should have said 8 years ago. He moved toward the door, each step looking like it cost him. I hope you build something extraordinary with the life you chose. You deserve that. You always did. Peter. I stood, walked to him, took his hand one last time. It was cold. Too cold. I forgive you. Not because you've earned it, but because carrying anger toward you would poison me the same way carrying your darkness did. So, I forgive you. And I release you. He looked at me with eyes that were already starting to film over with that particular distance that comes before the end. I loved you, you know. I just didn't know what that meant until it was too late. I know, I whispered. I know. He kissed my forehead. A gentle benediction. Then he left. I didn't see him again. 3 weeks later, Ingrid called. He's gone. Died in his sleep. Peacefully, if that matters. He left instructions. He wants you at the burial. I drove up to the mountains alone. Found them gathered at a clearing overlooking Denver, a small group of vampires who'd known him for decades, centuries, who stood around his grave with the particular stillness of immortals confronting mortality. Ingrid handed me a shovel. He asked that you be the one to cover him. Said something about you being the last person who knew him as human. I stood at the edge of that grave looking down at Peter Stalin wrapped in white silk, finally at rest, and I felt the complicated grief of mourning someone who hurt you and loved you and never quite figured out how to do both at the same time. I shoveled dirt.
Covered him.
buried the man he could have been along with the man he was. When it was done, when everyone else had drifted away to their cars and their immortal lives, I sat at the edge of that grave and cried. Not for him.
For me.
For the woman I'd been who thought love meant disappearing. For the 8 years I'd given to someone who only learned my value by losing it. And then I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, walked back to my car. I buried him in the mountains outside Denver. Not because he deserved it, but because I needed to. There are others like me in the city. Women who gave years to men who only understood value in retrospect. We don't talk about it at coffee shops or therapy groups. But we recognize each other in the way we hold our spines a little straighter, the way we've learned that walking away isn't cruelty, it's mercy. If this story felt like your own, you're not alone. There are more here. Stories about women who chose themselves when it was the hardest thing they'd ever done. About the kind of love that asks too much and the kind of strength it takes to say no. They don't show up everywhere, but they exist. And if you let them slip past, you might spend longer than you need to thinking you're the only one who understands what it costs to be someone's everything. I drove back down the mountain, past the slate tower with its empty penthouse, past the life I'd built in his shadow. I drove toward my own apartment, my own career, my own future that existed independent of anyone else's empire. And for the first time in 8 years, maybe in my entire life, I felt free. Not because the man I'd loved was gone, but because I'd finally learned that some people can only teach you about love by showing you what it isn't. And surviving that lesson is its own kind of salvation.